I am an OG Dark Souls 2 hater. Back on release, I bought the Black Armor Edition with glee, having just spent the previous summer fighting for my life with the first game. After popping it in my Xbox 360, I played, and played, and played, suffering every step of the way. Now granted, I was running a production of Anything Goes at the time, so the sleep deprivation and constant Cole Porter stuck in my head in a loop probably did make it worse. But after finishing it, I really had no desire to play any more of it. I skipped the DLC, I took the disc out of the console, and that was that. I couldn't put it into words, but it felt like I was way worse at the game than I had been in Dark Souls 1, and struggled so much that the game was actively harder for me since I just died too often. It wasn't until the infamous Matthew Matosis video that I was given the words to describe what I felt. Hatred. I grew to despise this game. I fought with anyone who said it was a good game or even an okay game. I said it was a bad game. And in fact, the first 2 drafts of this script before I really got invested in the game were about how bad it was. This all comes from a place of the game being the issue. Couldn't be me. I was good at Souls game, and my dick is massive. This then informs the next 10 years of discourse surrounding the game. A few years after the Matthew Matosis video, H-Bomber did his Defense of Dark Souls 2 video, which was pretty mixed in reception. At this time, he was mostly known for calling Fallout 3 garbage, which, yeah. So this was really in line with his, at the time, contradictory style. Then Mahler made an 8-hour response to Bomber's response to Matthew's response. I watched all of this in May 2018, by the way. I was working as a curbside grocery specialist, and we weren't supposed to have earbuds in, but I did. And I listened to the Mahler video over the entirety of a whole shift. I can't say I recommend that. After that, the last word was not only that Dark Souls 2 was a bad Souls game, but also a bad game. This was an irreversible lock of online sentiment, which I also bought into. It wasn't until recently I actually started hearing about people liking the game. Naturally, me being the informed and online Chad that I am, blew it off as contradictory people begging for attention. In my previous versions of the script, before I did really get settled in the playthrough, I even said that this game felt like Lords of the Fallen to me, which is a damning criticism. That game is terrible, both of them. So what did these guys know that I didn't? I got a Steam Deck in October. The nice thing about the Steam Deck is it makes replaying games easier and more time effective. I did a replay of Metal Gear Solid 5, a game that I also used to heavily criticize because the internet said so. And not only did I end up loving it, it's now my favorite game of all time. Don't worry, I'll be doing a video on that one next. Realizing that potentially my 19-year-old self may not be correct anymore, I bought the game on sale and threw it in my backlog. I replayed Kingdom Hearts 2 on Critical and learned the value of learning that the game wants me to do specific things instead of just assuming I know what I'm doing and brute forcing it. This in mind, I decided it was time to retake the plunge on Dark Souls 2. I wanted to figure out why this could be someone's favorite game. Why would someone love this? How could they? Didn't they know Feeble King made 3 different videos calling it bad? This is also the first video in a series I'm starting called Full Immersion. In this series, I'm going to do what I do best. Hyperfixate. I will play the game, learn its mechanics thoroughly, study videos about the game, explore its community spaces like its forums and its subreddit, and really live the game for however long that takes. I really want to understand games, in and out, and I want to know what it is that causes a community to form around them. Dark Souls 2 is the first because this is the game that has my biggest want for understanding. People love this game. I want to know why they love it. I want to know why I wrote it off for 10 years, but other people felt that there was something genuinely special here. Some people even say it's the best one. I've watched a ton of video essays from YouTubers big and small, Souls-focused, non-Souls-focused, scoured subreddits, forums, and I spent a healthy amount of time with the game. And that said, this is still just my opinion. So if you don't like my conclusions, then, fine.
There's so many examples of DS2 clearly just missing the mark on what it means to be hard but fair.
I think the logical first step to understanding Dark Souls 2 is to discuss why people view it as the worst Souls game, or even a bad game, worse than you remember, etc. There's quite a few reiterated talking points that I'll be discussing and offering rebuttals towards. Remember that these were opinions I myself shared until I really got to grips with the game and understood it in its own terms. These talking points largely originate from Matthew Matosis' video and have been expanded on to about the edge of what I think there really is to say about them. This is not to say it was wrong of Matthew Matosis to make that video, or even that those points are necessarily wrong. That's just how he felt with the game at the time. It's more so that these complaints are never truly explored, discussed, pushed back on, and when they are, someone's going to make an 8-hour video essay about why you're wrong. All this to say, That was Matthew Matosas' experience of the game. This is mine. Okay, now to talk about why I'm correct. Every time you die, you lose 5% of your health total. This is usually one of the two most common complaints about the game. The idea is that this is antithetical to FromSoft's quote-unquote tough but fair approach to difficulty. The idea that you are meant to slowly and methodically learn the game and its encounters, and death is only so much as a penalty as what is deemed as fair. Reducing your health upon death has now become unfair as it punishes repeat deaths and learning attempts. The idea being that this discourages repeated attempts at bosses or tough areas. This is not considered, quote, tough but fair, unquote. While, yes, this is something that can be inferred based on the general themes and ideas of these games, I don't think this has ever really been etched into stone as a mission statement of From Software or of any of the Souls games or even Elden Ring. This matters because the idea of, quote, tough but fair, unquote, is really subjective. The interesting things about these games is they are very individualized adventures where a boss struggle I could have be one you completed in one phase. Just because Ava was the hardest boss for me, it could be the easiest boss for you. How would one even determine tough but fair, knowing that tough for me is different than any other player? Or fairness? Is it fair to be difficult? Isn't the concept of fairness antithetical to difficulty in a lot of ways? Is the Capra Demon fight fair? Fuck no, that fight sucks so bad. What about the Bed of Chaos? Is Pinwheel unfair towards Pinwheel? I struggled against the God-devouring serpent in Elden Ring. Now, is that an unfair fight? Is a fair fight an interesting one? Is anyone really interested in a truly fair fight? Wouldn't that just be too easy? And isn't an easy fight a fair fight then? There's just too many ways to pick apart this statement and realize it doesn't really make sense in the grander nature of the series. These games are meant to provide you problems that you find solutions towards. If they were fair, I don't really think they'd be problems. A problem is not inherently fair, much like it is in life. Reducing your health is fair because the game establishes it as part of the rules of its gameplay. You're right that Dark Souls 1 and 3 don't do this, but because they chose not to. Dark Souls 2 did. Regardless on how you feel, this is a part of the experience as intended by the developers and just something you learn to work around. To be honest, I always thought this bothered me because I was told that it did. I was told it was just to make the game artificially harder, that this is a B team that understands that difficulty is the point and not fairness, whatever that means. What I actually think is that this is meant to be an easier version of Demon's Souls' soul system. That sounds even more punishing than this system. If you recall, when you died in Demon's Souls, your health got a blanket 50% reduction. There wasn't a 5% until 50, there was no ring to prevent it. That was it. And every time you died, world tendency kicked in, which would mean you were invaded by more and more NPCs because you sucked and it sucks to be you. In reality, if you're trying to block or avoid damage, the amount of health you really have doesn't matter, which is worth saying because it seems like the consensus around these games is that the dodge roll matters a lot. You want to be not taking damage, not blocking damage or tanking damage unless your build provides for that. I think it's important to remember again that these games are about giving you a problem and letting you find its solution, and in this case, losing a part of yourself every time you die is just another problem to solve and thematically accurate. If you're worried about your total health, pop a human effigy. These are honestly very common in the game, and I feel like it feels like these items actually matter in gameplay. When I think about Humanity, which is the first game's equivalent to human effigies, those felt like they existed specifically to just turn on summoning, and yeah, sometimes you could kindle bonfires, but for the most part, it seems like people would just stockpile them to pop them for easy health regen. And that's cool, but not altogether a unique effect. I feel like effigies, on the other hand, serve the role of resetting your health to its max, and they are plentiful enough that you will probably end up with about 20 in your inventory on average. I usually did. Enemies drop them. They can be found around the world. They can be purchased. Pretty much almost every vendor has them. And it may just be me, but I also find it kind of refreshing to pop an effigy before starting a boss encounter and getting the feeling that you are restored and energized. I honestly think that this is the most efficient risk versus reward humanity system in the trilogy, since outside of summoning, there's not a lot of reason to restore humanity in 1 or 3. It does give you a 30% flat health boost in 3, but that's on top of the health you already had, so if you play Unkindled a lot, I just don't feel like there's a large health boost there. You could argue that this is solving a problem the developers made themselves, but all 3 games retain the humanity system, so it is a part of the games at this point. I just think it's nice that I have a reason to care about earning effigies over embers or humanities. There is a narrative purpose here too, but we're going to get to that. Second most commonly heard criticism is that there are just too many enemies at too high a density in the game. These areas are filled with large groups of enemies who are meant to drown and overwhelm the player, and after all, Souls combat is meant to be a 1v1 system, right?
The mechanics of the Souls games are built for one-on-one engagements, thanks to its slow attack animations which are uninterruptible once they start, and a lock-on camera which focuses heavily on a single foe.
Now, disregarding the fact that I just don't think it's fair to simplify Souls combat to only working on one-on-ones, I also think it's incredibly limiting on what can be explored with the mechanics of the series. Ornstein and Smough are one of, if not the best boss fights in all these games because there's being 2-on-1. That made it unique. This is a whole other set of challenges that are completely different than a one-on-one, and it's a great filter of players for a reason. Now, I don't think it's because the fight is unfair. All the fights are generally unfair. But because the player hasn't had to break out of single target combat very much until then. This could be applied a bit looser to the Belfry Gargoyles fight as well, because that does become a 2-on-1 if you're not summoning, but in a more fair way, whatever that means. Maybe it's because the second gargoyle comes in at half health. Now, the player hasn't really trained for a 2v1 up until this fight, so even if their build is complete and they have a good experience of the game, it's going to take some adjustment to fully understand how to navigate the arena in a way that allows them to fight the two bosses at the same time without getting murked. Now, tell me why Dark Souls 2 is hated for this same feature, because it's built around multi-character fights, and usually that's against the player. The first thing I think is valid to say against this as a criticism is that the game isn't really built on the framework of 1v1 combat. That's just what you're used to. Just because you have to learn something doesn't make it bad.
When you think about it, his argument actually is that the lock-on system works best against single enemies. And he's right about that. But that's why you don't lock on in a fight against multiple enemies. Arguably the main lesson you're taught as early on as the first real areas is that enemies are attacking from all over the place, and you ought to keep your wits about you more than just pressing the button that focuses on one person and hoping for the best. This is a game that prides itself on expecting you to look where you're going, even as far back as the first game, with the guy hiding behind the doorway and people hiding in corners even all the way over in Bloodborne. The lock-on system is a tool to be utilised carefully, just like every other ability and mechanic.
Now here, H. Bomber Guy recommends not locking on in order to have better control of the camera and situational awareness. Next thing you might say is, oh, yeah, this is effective, but it's not explained anywhere in the game. And yeah, that's correct, but also this is a Souls game. I thought we liked these games because they didn't hold your hand. Wouldn't it feel odd to be going into your first crowd fight and then have Solaire come over your comms and say, hey dude, watch out, Curse Bearer, these enemies, they'll attack you all at once. You better not lock on, it'll be easier.
Mega Man, there's a hole in the zipline that you...
No, shut up, I don't need you!
I thought we hated that. I thought we didn't want that in these games. So why would we need anything explaining this? Yeah, a Soapstone message could explain it, but are you gonna use those to explain how to fight every single enemy? You have to take the time to actually learn what works in combat encounters, and this is perfectly fine in other games, but for some reason, just not here. Another thing worth talking about here too is the way that most people who don't like this game don't want to actually play the game. They'll complain that the amount of enemies makes runbacks long and difficult, and the lack of iframes on the fog walls makes it hard to just dash back. So at no point does anything in your brain say, oh, I'm supposed to engage with these enemies? Runbacks are not automatically a breeze just because there's a boss at the end of them. There are really long, arduous ones in every game, not just this one. We're going to bring the Capra Demon back in because that boss runback honestly sucks. There's dogs there. I don't like dogs. Most of these clips show the player blindly aggroing every enemy, trying to outrun them, and then getting clobbered because they dove into a hornet's nest without thinking. You have to actually fight the enemies that are in a location. And you know what? If your build is good, then it isn't really that hard. And the game even does you a favor and despawns enemies after they've been killed 12 times. Well, but I don't want to kill them 12 times. Well, if you're going to make that many attempts at a runback, you may as well. There is a system here. You just have to want to use it. Is it too grindy? Should they despawn after one kill? Would that be fair? Is it fair to never despawn? Is it fair that if there's only one enemy instead of 5? Do you see how fast this kind of logic falls apart because the game isn't built around anyone's idea of fairness except the developers? Too many enemies means you have to start navigating around them rather than complaining that's too hard. What I ended up liking about this is once I learned how to play the game, that there is a way to effectively train enemies like in Call of Duty Zombies, which is exhilarating. If you don't know what training is, that is basically running enemies in a circle behind you and then taking pot shots as you're coming back around in the circle. There's a lot of control that has to be exercised in this method, and you can't really autopilot through it, and that's probably why people don't like this, because it takes a second of thought. The other games do too, but you can't use brute force here like you could there. On the topic of runbacks too, let's go ahead and just discuss that Dark Souls 2 does not really have very many runbacks that are as arduous as anything else in the other games. Once again, I'm going to tell you, because there's a boss behind the fog wall doesn't mean you automatically get a free pass to just run up and challenge it again. That's part of the experience. Belfry Gargoyles, Capra Demon, even the Tauros Demon do have runbacks with enemies. And yeah, you can run around them, but also should you just not? I mean, wouldn't it be beneficial to kill them, gain the souls? And I mean, if you're really a good player and you're really trying to just attempt the boss, then you shouldn't be getting hit, right? On top of that, if I had to name the 2 boss runbacks that I do think are whatever difficulty you want to call them more so than the rest of the game, it's probably going to be the one to the Undead Chariot and to Sir Alon. Now, the Undead Chariot I did not find to be difficult because I was using a lightning-infused weapon, which just dips on those enemies. Also, you aggro them one at a time unless you run through it like an idiot. And then the run back to Sir Alon, that is challenging, yes. This is a co-op central area, which we'll get into a little bit later. Is this still applicable for bosses? Yes, in 2 ways. One is still very relevant to my earlier point of learning to make use of space and movement to keep enemies within the right distance, while the other is probably going to be a little more controversial. Keeping enemies in kiting distance still works for bosses, like Twin Dragon Riders, who you can avoid the arrows by continuing to move or staying underneath the effective range of the archer. I like this a lot. Something about exerting total control over both your environment and enemies in a Soul game makes my hands tingle. Could also just be arthritis. The training system can even work on enemy bosses like the Ruin Sentinels, although some are really fast and ready to make it your problem. That said, this does take focus and concentration. One slip-up can derail your entire system, but it wouldn't be Souls if it didn't. The other option you have to deal with these kinds of situations where you're fighting multiple bosses is, of course, summoning. If you play these games without summoning because that's how you play them, great. I think it's one of the best things about Souls games that you can modulate your difficulty in natural and endemic ways, like summons or magic or infusion weapons. What I think makes this feel like less of a clear option in the small subset is the small subset of loud, and boy do I mean loud, people who can't stand the game being played any other way than they do. This is typically your greatsword, high-strength builds that are too stubborn to really try new mechanics or ideas and brute force their way through encounters. Regardless of your opinion on them, summons are a major part of the game and exist to help players experience the encounters. What I like about Dark Souls 2 is the way the game builds areas that are co-op-centric, or can be done in co-op without feeling too powerful. Scholar even has the room for up to 4 summons, meaning you could really spread chaos if you wanted to. For me, I like using summons for drawing aggro, so that I don't have to think as hard about my positioning or my attack pattern. I am playing the game in the year of our Lord 2025, so there's not really a lot of actual people that you can summon. Or if there are, I'm not patient enough to wait for their sign to go down, so I end up using the NPCs. Now, I'm sure that the guys I mentioned earlier will be upset knowing that I use summons as a part of the game that exists, because by their metric, it cheapens the experience or is baby mode. The fact of the matter is, I don't really care what these people have to say from this angle. It honestly sounds like they suffered because they refused to try the game systems or use tools offered to them for man cred, and anyone who doesn't suffer like they did has to be accosted, or it will mean that they wasted all their time for no reason. Most people would rather be shot dead than be wrong, after all. For the record, there's not really a right way to play these games, but I think refusing to use the systems it offers you on the principle that it's the objectively correct way to play is actually wrong. If you think me using the systems the game offers me cheapens my opinion in any way, I will say that I think the same of you, because there are people who have beat these games blindfolded while also playing 2 different games in different ways at the same time. If they say that about me, well, okay, they're probably right. But if you haven't done that, I'm not interested in hearing what you have to say about it. Being able to use summons really matters in non-boss areas for once, because there's actually a lot of large open areas worth exploring. You tend to get pretty far from the last bonfire pretty easily, and there are extra ones, but a lot of them are hidden behind illusory walls. By the way, some of the essays I've watched have genuinely complained that illusory walls are interacted with instead of hit. Like, this is such a non-issue. I just find it silly. I just needed to throw it in somewhere. They also complained about the existence of illusory walls and that there are bonfires that are hidden, as a reward. And that seems to be a problem for a certain kind of player because they have to actually go out and find it. Well, I'm sorry that the game didn't give you the bonfire on a silver platter. Weenie Hut Jr.'s over there. Maybe you should go see what they got for you. I think this is implemented really well in the DLC co-op areas. If you try to solo these areas, they are incredibly difficult. There's stuff flying everywhere, high poise enemies, and it's almost just too much. If only there was some way for someone to help you. These areas are built for co-op, and playing with even NPC summons makes it so interesting and chaotic, in a good way. I love rolling to reposition myself and watching the NPC summon get rolled by a curse statue. This honestly gets kind of close to Monster Hunter in its execution. I said kind of, in that now boss fights can be built for multiplayer functionality instead of you're just your sad greatsword guy. I had a lot of fun fighting bosses like Sin or Mirror Knight with backup so I can enjoy the fight without having to be locked in the whole way through. Again, I know people don't like to play with it, and that's fine, but just don't dismiss someone else's opinion because you don't use certain features on offer to you. The Cave of the Dead Gang Squad fight is another that is pretty clearly built for summon assistance. I didn't know this until recently, but the DLCs even featured these statue summoning signposts for people who didn't have the DLCs in vanilla to join and assist you and get some DLC-specific loot. This is really cool, honestly, and is a really great way to encourage more cooperation in these areas that really demand it. Now, does the Gang Squad push the boundaries of what I personally feel is acceptable in the difficulty of a boss fight? Yeah. But that's possibly because the NPC summons don't do any damage and are not even good at drawing aggro in this fight. I think my other hang up with this fight mechanically is that the bosses use player movesets, which are absolutely way better than any other enemies' movesets, have high poise, can track you about as aggressively as average enemies that don't have those kind of wicked movesets. The Dragon's Tooth is not meant to track you the way that it does track you, let me tell you. I think I probably would have really liked this fight if I had legitimate companions, but it is beatable, and while being one of my least favorite fights in the game, is still one I felt was reasonable to complete. I don't really have a lot to add to the ambush section that already wasn't covered in my enemy density section, but this is also a very Souls thing to do. Seriously, if you go back and replay Dark Souls 1 and just play up through the Gaping Dragon, you will get ambushed several times. Tons of stuff in these games do random things just to keep you on the toes. Hell, even multi-phase boss fights are meant to keep you guessing and learning. You can't really be upset at one ambush because it's meant to be a surprise. It's meant to stop you from getting comfortable progressing. If you keep falling for it after the first time, that is user error. Now, something else that upsets people about the game in regards to enemy density and ambushes is the changes to the rolling system through adaptability. Now, on the surface, it seems like a random change that's poorly communicated, despite literally every Reddit comment telling people to level it to at least 25. The games are never good at explaining their systems, yet we love them. So why is this different? Well, because it affects the iframes on rolls. People use rolls to maneuver and avoid damage in place of a shield, and it does work pretty well for that. In fact, I don't think I ever use a shield when I replay any of these games unless my build specifically wants to use a shield. That said, is that intended? Is that okay in the sense that it makes shields obsolete? Ranged magic with a roll should in theory make you unkillable, hence why it's considered another baby mode tool. I think this is a worthwhile discussion to have, since why keep shields in the game if dodging and rolling are just going to be better alternatives? Bloodborne literally has one shield and it sucks so bad that it's a meme. It's possible, right? I think Dark Souls 2 is trying to make rolling more of a system than just a mechanic and make it something that takes a little more work to use. Naturally, understanding roll timing also matters and plays into learning fights, but I can see why from a design standpoint it might make sense to make players earn a better roll first so that they at least have to try to learn fights without spamming the B button. There's a great video that breaks down how rolling works with adaptability and agility from Metalhead, and it explains some of the weird stuff that gets attributed to hitbox issues and rolling that don't actually exist.
Another misconception surrounding rolling pertains to videos like this one of the Pursuer grab attack, where a player seemingly rolls through the attack and gets grabbed anyway. It is easy to blame this on ADP or bad hitboxes, since a majority of players do not understand the mechanics behind this footage. Let's slow it down to show what is happening here. As you can see, this player's foot is getting clipped by the grab hitbox as they don't have iframes at this point in their roll. This is not the fault of adaptability, agility, or the hitboxes, but is an issue with the grab animations and the player themselves. The way grab attacks work across the entire Souls franchise can be very visually comical. You can see janky grab animations happen in other entries in the franchise with the grab attacks of Iron Golem, Dancer of the Boreal Valley, Gaping Dragon, and more. This is because the roll animation is prioritized to finish first, while the grab attack animation is queued. This causes the roll animation to play out fully, then the grab attack animation plays, making the player seemingly teleport to the end of the Pursuer's sword. Dark Souls 2 hitboxes are considered to be poor as people aren't able to see the actual hitboxes and are judging based on janky animations. To put this in further perspective, let's look at the grab attacks from the perspective of strafing. You can see that the player character is extremely close to the sword but is not getting grabbed because they are not actually getting hit, unlike with the player's foot earlier. With Hitbox Visualizer on, we can see that the hitbox is nicely aligned with the sword. The issue in this popular video does not stem from bad hitboxes or bad rolling mechanics, but the personal skill of the player in the video coupled with the way animations are cued.
The hitbox misconception is one that really strains the game for people, myself included, until I saw it. I thought the hitboxes were really bad, when in all honesty, let me tell you, Dark Souls 2 probably has some of the best hitboxes of the entire series. Once again, if you don't believe me, there's plenty of clips of 1 and 3 having weird, funky stuff happening with their hitboxes. After understanding how it all works, I also learned this cool new trick called counter-strafing. I think this improves the way I play the game tremendously and contributes to the depth of learning the game itself. I'm not expecting everyone to really jive with the change since it was reverted in 3, but I just wanted to add some context into why I think it matters. I don't think it's correct or incorrect, it's just here in Dark Souls 2. Get used to it. The leveling aspect itself should probably be reduced some since 25 to 30 and adaptability is a decent stat investment, and I don't mind grinding souls in the Tower of Flame since this is an RPG and you're free to make that choice, but I'm sure there are people who don't want a grind ever. Now, I don't think these are the right games to take that stance on, since working on a boss itself is a grind, but because there's a more solid number attached to it, I think some players may veer away from this idea. If you don't want to grind, but also still want to not take damage and also don't want to take the time to level adaptability, hey, guess what? Pick up a shield. This may sound ironic and like I'm making fun of you, but to be honest, there's now a legitimate use case for shields, and 2 provides a healthy choice of shields to choose from. You do have choices here. I'm sorry if you don't like any of them, but there are options available for a player who wants to just do what they did in Dark Souls 1. Me, personally, I don't mind grinding giants in Heidi's Tower of Flame for an hour just to get it over with while I listen to a podcast. I like grinding, not a big deal for me. Your mileage may vary. Another change system is healing. This time, the Estus Flask is reduced from starting at 5 charges to just 1 at the start of the game. That said, there are ways to improve the Estus to above what was offered in Dark Souls 1, getting to a consistent 10 charges and a plus 5 bonus on healing. I looked up a guide to find these items because this is my 3rd playthrough, but I also don't really mind using guides normally because I don't really like pretending the internet doesn't exist, so I can try to prove a point about how hard it is to find certain items that are meant to be hidden. The Estus animation has also been lengthened, which upsets people as they want to be able to heal quickly mid-fight. I think this was pretty obviously intentional, as healing is the most valuable resource in the game. Choosing when to heal in a fight is almost more important than the fight itself, and if you make it too easy or you make it too powerful to use, then there's not really more strategy to the challenge of using it. I feel like a lot of fights in Dark Souls 1 end up being versus the Estus Flask instead of the enemies, trying to find the right time to disengage from the enemy, use the flask, try not to get hit, get back in there. The flask is my enemy and my friend, am I right, fellas? This change creates a power curve that feels in line with more traditional linear difficulty curves, giving you more healing power as you fight tougher enemies. Now, if you don't like that, you also get life gems. Since these can be bought from a vendor, there's this opinion that these somehow break the game, and I just don't see that. Yes, in theory, you can out-heal damage, but it's very uncommon to be able to do this mid to late game with base form life gems, which are the only ones that are infinitely buyable. They just heal too slow and they take too long to use. What I find these actually do are they are nice supplements to the large areas to explore where bonfires may be farther away or mechanics like poison are prevalent. This lets the developers make a high-stress area like Black Gulch where using life gems can offset the constant poison damage. I'm sure some people don't like that this is present at all, but you do have that option to mitigate it. If you don't like the area or the mechanics, fine, but you can't ignore that there is a solution present and usable to make your life easier. This is the most approachable poison area in the entirety of the games. I also hate to break it to you, but hard games will usually have hard areas, and if this is too much, good luck with Blight. Too many bosses are just guys in suits of armor. Except not that much, really, honestly. Here, I'm going to put a number on the screen of how many bosses are actually in suits of armor. I think it's like 13 or 14, but I wrote this like a couple of days ago, so I don't fully remember what I looked up. Most of the bosses are pretty conceptually different from each other, such as the Demon of Song, or the Guardian Dragon, or the Flexile Sentry. So this ends up feeling like a pretty disingenuous assertion, even when applied to the enemies of the game. Base game mobs are still pretty varied, and the nice thing is even the guys in armor are pretty mixed up. Like, they're really good about mixing their abilities and movesets. You get Mastodons, you get Peter Dinklages. Even if we were to take this at face value as a criticism, it's because the game's direction called for it. Thematically, you are in a dead kingdom built on top of a bunch of dead kingdoms, one of which is even Lordran. So, since most kingdoms have knights in it, it stands to reason there would be a lot of them. Even the non-human enemy types are pretty varied, with rats and dogs and mastodons. I have problems with this complaint because not understanding that a game has a direction just feels like you're willing to ignore things for the sake of ignoring it. If you were to make this argument about Bloodborne, that there's a lot of these things that you can't make heads or tails about, it wouldn't make sense. That's just the direction of the game. That's what Bloodborne is. I think that it makes more sense than just having bosses thrown around without too much rhyme or reason just for the sake of being different. Not thinking of anyone in particular. I don't have a lot to say because this is a non-argument. All these games reuse bosses or use them as standard enemies later in the game as a way to power scale you and show that you are indeed stronger now. In fact, there's usually lore explanations as to why they are there. For example, the Dragon Rider is not just a one guy. There's actually a lot of Dragon Riders that were part of Vendrick's army, so finding more than one makes a lot of sense. If you don't believe me, if that's not enough, here's a lovely video explaining how Elden Ring is actually worse about this than Dark Souls 2.
From what I can gather, there are 165 boss encounters in Elden Ring, which are made up from only 79 unique bosses. Dark Souls 2 has 42 bosses in total, with 38 of them unique. The 4 repeats being Ludden-Zalin, Blue Smelter, Twin Dragon Riders, and, I guess, Old Dragon Slayer? It's not really a repeat since it only appears once in this game, but either way, that's still quite a difference percentage-wise. Even if we give Elden Ring the benefit of the doubt and include an additional 44 bosses with significant changes, we're still only at 75%. And if we apply the same criteria to Dark Souls 2's bosses, we can add all of those back in and we land at 100%. None of this really matters though, because 79 is more than 38, with Elden Ring's bosses generally being at a higher quality anyway. Still, it is fascinating because this is something Dark Souls 2 got a lot of flack for back in the day. But when we look back on it now, it's surprising to see how few repeats there actually were. Some people say they don't like that they make the bosses appear as normal enemies later on, but Elden Ring and Dark Souls both did this, and I fail to see how it's done any better in those games.
This one's going to be a bit harder to explain since I think that there is a real thematic reason to the world design, but for this section, I'm going to try to keep it to how the world functions mechanically. The world is a bunch of smaller worlds surrounding Majula as a central hub, sort of like a starfish, per Noah Caldwell Dravai. Each of these have undead Berg levels of depth and discovery, which I think is pretty impressive. People will talk about the lack of connectedness in the world, but that's not really supposed to be here. I think the world is meant to be scattered and shattered and different and discordant. These are different chunks of kingdoms bobbing up to the surface as the world drowns itself in dark, and I think Majula does a good job of giving each world a road that makes enough sense to connect to it. Dark Souls 3 slaps you down in a bonfire and says, yeah, teleport to High Wall of Lothric. So if you're going to complain about this, you should probably also complain about that. This feels like it has at least a little bit more effort put into it. Boss runbacks will also receive a lot of criticism for being so overly enemy-laden, and that the world doesn't focus enough about shortcuts, and I just don't think that that's really the thing that the game is trying to do. The game gives you life gems, it gives you effigies, it gives you 1,000 ways to fight enemies. To be honest with you, this is just a Souls game. Sorry. I don't think the worlds need to really be congruent anyways to make sense as a whole in this game. And I think it's better that they don't. I think this game really wants you to feel put off and smears everything like it's a dream. This is a very dreamy world. The elevator from Earthen Peak to Iron Keep is often used as some sort of disparagement to the way the world is laid out like it matters. Here is the original argument against it per Matthew Matosis.
The world doesn't fit together either logically or thematically. In Harvest Valley, you can get a clear view of Earthen Peak and see the surrounding area. After beating the Earthen Peak boss, you then get in an elevator and go straight up about 15 more floors, arriving at Iron Keep. There's no hint of Iron Keep whatsoever from the outside of Earthen Peak. From Harvest Valley, the sky is overcast, but in Iron Keep it has a red glow and the surrounding area is suddenly an enormous wasteland of lava.
Now, the amount of times I hear this criticism brought up, the amount of times I hear people reference this on Reddit, on YouTube, drives me insane. Because you're right, it doesn't matter, but it's not supposed to. Yes, Dark Souls 1 has this amazing sense of verticality that we all love, but if Dark Souls 2 did that again, it would just be copying Dark Souls 1. If it reversed it, then it would just be reversing what Dark Souls 1 did, and people would hate it for just being Dark Souls 1 but a sequel. I think this is the only sensible way to make it distinct as a sequel in its own way, and no, it doesn't make sense. It's not supposed to.
And in fact, I don't think I'll ever bother playing through Dark Souls 2 again. I've fallen out of love.
I was genuinely impressed with how much freedom and creativity Dark Souls 2 offered me. Granted, I didn't really start understanding build crafting until after I played Elden Ring, but this is another thing that brought me around to the game. 4 ring slots allow you to really narrow in on what you want your character to do and how you want to deal damage. We're going to be looking at the rapier build for an example so I can explain some of the different ways that the builds can be laid out in this game. This is probably the best TBS build. We're going to start the build with the weapon, which is the default rapier that you'd buy from the smith. You upgrade it like usual using materials. It's important to get it up to plus 10 because that improves its scaling with dexterity, which you're going to have high. And then you infuse it with a bolt stone for lightning damage. A lot of enemies in this game take lightning damage. Then you're going to buy 2 more, make one dark and make one magic. so that you have some options for different enemies and bosses. You can kind of min-max it. After getting these, you have the option of the Espada Ropa or the Ice Rapier, both of which are pretty good upgrades, but not so good that they outright replace a standard plus 10 Rapier. The Rapier is good because its damage is high and it has high dex scaling, and the thrust moveset is fast and not very stamina intensive. Combining this with elemental damage from infusion, and you can pretty consistently start 2 or 3 shotting enemies around Huntsman's Copse if you aren't rushing. Next are the rings. Ring of Blades is a must for any physical damage build, buffing damage outright. You'll then use the old Leo ring for extra damage on thrust counterattacks being a new thing, to my knowledge, and you'll be doing a lot of those. And the stone ring to break poise easier. Being able to poise break most enemies within 1 or 2 hits is really, really strong and helps mitigate this build's main weakness, which is its poor crowd control. The last ring is up to the user, but it's usually recommended to use Flynn's ring since you'll probably be using a low equip load. Now, I also found some success swapping this to the Lightning Clutch ring for some extra lightning damage from time to time, and the Cat ring to help with fall damage areas, the Serpent ring for extra souls, or putting on a Quartz ring for extra damage resistance, such as against Blue Smelter Demon who does magic damage. Blue Quartz ring plus 3, kinda goated. The amount of souls you receive is much higher in this game than the others, probably to accommodate the extra weapons and spells you receive as well as leveling adaptability. So you'll probably want to try a lot of stuff out. This does solve that adaptability issue provided you're actually earning those souls while also letting you get to your desired build within a certain amount of time. There's also an armor set which gives you a bonus souls if you're willing to sin to get it. And otherwise you're free to use whichever light armor you want. You could invest in Vigor to wear heavier armor, but I also think you'll be mobile enough it won't really matter too much if you don't. After swapping from the Seldora set I used for extra souls, I used the Black Leather set for some poison, build up resistance, and then swapped to the Hexer set once I had 20 in faith and intelligence so that my dark weapon could work longer. Hey, here's another cool thing about the souls you get to level up, is you can then start using spells outside of spell dependent or pyro builds. Leveling your faith and intelligence up enough to use dark weapon is pretty crazy because what this does is applies a dark buff to your weapon. I also leveled faith for some extra lightning damage. I tried out some miracles for funsies, and then eventually I had enough intelligence to use the Sunset Staff and add a second spell slot for Dark Orb, which is also ridiculously strong, probably the best hex in the game. This ended up taking me into New Game Plus where I just started melting everything. I'm really genuinely impressed with the flexibility that the rings have on offer in the game because the first game doesn't really offer you build dependent rings. It's kind of more utility based rings. So I think it's really cool to actually make different mechanics of the combat matter more. The large variety of weapons on offer also allow a multitude of playstyles to be successful. As I researched the different weapons that were considered the best of the best, there were always a couple of slots in each list that differed. Now, make no mistake, the Warp Sword, Chaos Blade, Ice Rapier, Classic Greatsword, those are all always in those lists, but you can pick pretty much any weapon and make it work independently of your skill level. I'm still trying to get around to that Caestus build I want to try. This is a really robust build system that lets you get as overpowered as you want, provided you're willing to work for the build. I know that whole playing blind thing doesn't work as well for this, but I also don't think it's fair to expect the game to explain every spell or weapon to the player, but also not be too handholdy. I think the magic in doing a replay and just breaking the game with its own systems is great. It ends up being a really good time. Turns out I just needed to play Dark Souls 2 instead of Dark Souls 1.
I don't know how the game wants me to play it, and I probably never will. The development of this game was rushed without clear guidance until a new director stepped in to fix the mess that was Dark Souls 2.
There's a genuine theme to this game about remembrance. Multiple characters have things they forget about, things about themselves gone forever. You explore memories to find answers. You don't ever even really remember why you came to Drangleic in the first place. Does anyone even remember Drangleic truly? If you're like me, you're terrified of forgetting, of some future version of yourself looking at your daughter and not recognizing her. This is a true fear, a genuine fear that somehow ends up feeling more real because, yeah, dragons are scary, but so is my brain. I think it's really fascinating that the game can make a fear like that so real and personal. After all, you don't even remember why you're here in Drangleic, just that you came. Drangleic, speaking of, to me, is this world of duality. Light and dark pushing against and up with each other. I mean this metaphorically, but also literally, as the game's color palette and texture design are very foggy and very muted. There is still lots of color, comparatively to Dark Souls 3, which is very gray on purpose, but the world is getting ready to sleep and to fade away. Pops of light being what's left, keeping it illuminated. The character themselves offer light in the environment, and the high contrast of the colors allow specific moments and sections to pop and really illuminate the space. I think this is something very unique to Dark Souls 2 visually, and reflects the swallowing, drowning effect the dark has on this world. We know from early game builds and trailers that the lighting engine was originally going to be even darker and require a torch in several areas, but the engine couldn't really work on the 360 and PS3. Shocker, I know. There are still areas like the gutter that benefit from the torch pretty heavily. I also found that an area like the Shrine of Amana benefited from the torch as well, since it let you see through the water and catch those tricky little fall areas. Going through the game, you also see a lot of areas that play with the light and shadow pretty heavily on just a regular day. They are present with each other in all areas outside of the Throne of Want, which sits in an abyss. I think the world is very clear on the relationship between light and dark, which Majula sits in a permanent peaceful sunset. This world is sinking down, and it's not so much fading like Dark Souls 3, but really being engorged from within by Nashandra and the Daughters of the Dark. The next duality of the game is the pairs of leaders and their queens. Manus, the King of the Abyss, split his soul into 4 separate sisters upon his death in Artorias of the Abyss, whom then went on to find kingdoms to corrupt in their own ways. Alana, attached to the Sunken King, Alsana, attached to the Ivory King, Nadalia, attached to the Iron King, and Nashandra, attached to Vendrick. I would call him the Dark King. What I find crazy is that all 4 of these queens interact with their kings so differently. Alana seemed to have a genuine affection for the Sunken King until he was slain by Sir Jorg and the Drakeblood Knights. Fuck these guys, by the way. Alsana actually tried to help the Ivory King quell the chaos Eliam Lois by constantly praying and then freezing the world. Alsana never actually found the Iron King, who had passed long before she arrived at Broom Tower and ended up serving as a mother figure to Sir Raim, or the Fume Knight, aka this boss hurt my soul. Nashandra is really the only ontologically evil sister here, embodying Manus' want. It's a good thing you as the player are immune to the propaganda of a hot woman, especially one in green. Ah, damn it. I think it's worrying that we as a player are never quite sure if we're following our own will or the Emerald Heralds. Are we just doing the same thing Vendrick and the others did? We know she was created by Aldia after the previous Firekeepers realized what was going on and gave up, so is her will even her own? Were the other daughters following their own desires, or just what was left over from Manus? I thought people said this game's lore didn't make sense, but here I am, just genuinely intrigued by what it asks. I also have to ask what the human effigy is meant to be. In Dark Souls 1, humanity is a genuine, real thing. I mean, this is your way of restoring yourself to human. It is finite. When you die, you go back to being hollow. It's temporary. The human effigy functions pretty similarly, but it's also meant to be another version of you, this core idea of what you are, broken down into this little wicker doll. When you go to character creation, the Firekeeper hands you the human effigy. This is meant to be some sort of reflection of yourself. You're carrying these little dolls of you around. It's kind of fun to think about. There's a duality here too. Are you who you remember yourself to be? Is your effigy who you thought you were? Who are you really? There's a lot of nitpicking about how in the things betwixt, the player model is clearly a man, but some people will play as a woman. Does the human effigy not also kind of solve that? When you go to a new world, you can forget everything, but do you want to forget everything? Is it helpful to forget everything? I don't have answers to these questions, but these are questions that Dark Souls 2 left me with. Okay, I got another bone to pick. There's a sentiment that the game taunts you at the beginning. Now, leaving aside that the Crestfallen Warrior and other characters literally laugh at you in every other game, the statement, "You'll walk this world without really knowing why," is verifiably true. Saying that your intentions are unclear is true of all the games. Why do you choose to link the fire in DS1? Frampt said so. Find the fire linkers in Dark Souls 3, because someone told you to. Dark Souls 2 is the most honest of the 3, telling you that your will is not your own in this world. Here's a human effigy. We think it's you. We think this is your will. This is going to be hard, and yes, you're going to die a lot.
You can practically hear the developers laughing at your expense as she says this. They're basically saying, we made this game really hard. That's what you wanted, right?
Picking an argument out of this statement is so shallow and pedantic and just erring towards hating the game blindly. It's laughing at me because it knows it's hard. Well, yeah, but all of them are. The point of these games, say it with me, are to not hold your hand and make you work with it. Just like we talked about earlier. You can't be mad at Dark Souls 2 for being a Dark Souls game. To say that this game has any different intentions in what it's doing and what it's going to do to you is just wrong. I'm sorry you got offended by the computer ladies laughing at you. They've seen it all. They've seen thousands of versions of you come through saying, I'm going to become the next big soul. And they probably know who you were before. Here's your human effigy. Get to it, kid. I also want to talk about how this is the end of the world. In Dark Souls 1 and 3, the world is ending. The fire is fading. But I think in Dark Souls 2, the fire faded. Vendrick pretty clearly refused to link the flame. This is a world that is not ending. It is ended past tense. This allows the world to have that trademark end of days craziness about it, to have this very stoic, silent feeling towards it. People will complain like these environments don't have any furniture, they don't feel like places people lived in. Well, because they're not really places that people lived in, or they're memories of places people lived in, but they're not really fully there. Again, these are just locations that are bobbing to the top of what's left of the world, being swallowed by darkness because there's powerful souls keeping them afloat. Drangleic and everything stuck under it is already finished. Lordran is included here as well, much to some people's chagrin.
One of the earliest questions I asked myself after they announced Dark Souls 2 was how much Solera pandering there was going to be. I can't even begin to tell you how hard my eyes rolled once I read the description for the Great Lightning Spear and saw it talk about a grossly incandescent father. Solera is one of my favourite characters in any of the Souls games, but he has absolutely no place in Dark Souls 2. We're talking about a time frame where nearly everything from the time of Lordran has been forgotten, but the one covenant which happens to survive intact just happens to be the same one the community won't shut up about. It makes no sense, and it's clearly just playing into the attachment people have to Solera. You can even leave praise the sun messages if you want to run it even further into the ground. The last thing I ever wanted a Souls game to do was pander to people in this kind of way, especially since the games are known for their bleak atmospheres.
I honestly think this is a ridiculous argument about what sequels of games typically do. Most sequels are, sequels, meaning that there is at least some part of the previous game that will be present in them. Solera being the most popular character from the first game and having his covenant make it back in some form is a response to the fan base finding something to love and attach to. Now, if this was Solaire's in Fortnite, then yeah, we can have that argument about whether it's pandering or not. But Solaire himself is not even in Dark Souls 2, just a reference to what he is, an effigy, if you will. And I think that's perfectly tasteful. I think it's unfair to hold Dark Souls 2 to this standard and then let Dark Souls 3 be loved for literally making Lordran 2 with many of the characters coming back in their original or modified configuration. Again, I understand what a sequel is, so it doesn't really bother me, but if you need something pedantic to get mad at, I don't think this is it. The world also gets modified in New Game Plus, with certain areas being remixed and Red Phantoms being added to supplement your insane level of power. I would really like to see them go further with this and change physical elements of the world too, but that probably would have made my Xbox 360 explode. There is also some new lore in New Game Plus, which each of the old ones being directly connected to the great souls of the first game. This is where the setup of cycles really coalesced into action as the legitimate plot thread and gives you more than just that revenge tour out of New Game Plus. I think it's a shame the other games never really took advantage of this idea, especially Elden Ring, although I suppose it's fair that I can't really ask too much more out of that game.
I really want to drive it home that this game is not a bad game, but it is the worst one of the Souls games.
This game's DLC, The Three Crowns, is often labeled as the best DLC in the entirety of the Souls games. Now, I heard this mostly prior to Shadow of the Erdtree, which I haven't played yet, but I'm trying to get there, I swear. But I do think this is 2/3 of the way. I'm really impressed with Shulva and Broom Tower. These areas explore vertically in ways the series just hasn't done before and didn't again until Elden Ring. Shulva feels like this large puzzle, and I like the way Joseph Anderson puts it here. Fighting Sin with 3 summons, as I said earlier, makes it feel like Monster Hunter, which is really fucking sweet, honestly, and gets me excited for Night Rain. In Lana summoning another boss entirely is a lot of fun, even if she is basically just Nashandra but with a summon. If I can do it, so can she. Broom Tower also impresses me with its spanning vistas atop massive chains and mountains of ash. There's no better metaphor for a fire that's burnt out than just ash. The raw verticality on display with both areas and the use of key items to unite the entirety of the area through lifts and other mechanics is just so smart and engaging. The co-op specific areas are, as I said earlier, very interesting to me as well. Being able to include people from the vanilla game before Scholar of the First Sin made it available for everybody. I like the thought of these games getting more engaged with the multiplayer elements and building around them. Remember, if you think the runbacks to Gang Squad and Blue Smelter are bad, it's probably because you're not supposed to solo them. I also want to talk a little bit about Blue Smelter because Blue Smelter often is the poster child of reused bosses in the game. Now, to be clear, I didn't struggle with regular Smelter or Blue Smelter very much. Yes, I died. I'm not perfect, but I don't find these guys to be like the epitome of hardness. They're certainly not a Fume Knight in any way. But also, I just kind of don't like these fights because the Lost Sinner and Flexile Sentry and Mirror Knight are just better fights in general. Smelter kind of bores me, kind of slow. The health reduction is offset by life gems. As far as optional bosses go, the Blue Smelter I find is fine, and I don't really have an issue with a boss replay in the DLC because the other 2 boss fights, Sir Alon and Fume Knight, are just awesome, excellent fights. Especially taking on Alon with Summon. Oh, I hope that pisses someone off. You may have noticed I haven't talked about the Ivory King DLC and Frozen Elium Lois, and to be honest with you, I don't like this DLC. Is this heretical? Well, I don't know. This is a video talking about how good Dark Souls 2 is. I think I'm allowed to criticize something. This area is more about wide-spanning horizontal progression, kind of like the base game. There's shortcuts, but nothing really quite as cool as turning the area on. Closest we get is there are parts area that thaw out after fighting Ava, but I don't really feel like this felt as rewarding because I ended up just walking longer and fighting worse enemies. Also, these hedgehog things, man, they do not work. They are the same awful tier of enemies as the dogs in these games, where they just hit you so fast and they're so small and can't adequately hit them back. I also don't really like the bosses all that much in this DLC. I thought Ava could have been a good fight, but I don't like fighting four-legged enemies in the original trilogy because they're just kind of jinky, kind of hard to hit, and it's hard to track a lot of her attacks. I probably struggled with her most in the whole game. Ivory King does have that cool extra night gimmick, but I'm going to be honest with you, it gets kind of old on your 4th or 5th try. A nice soul farm at the very least. I did not bother going to the frigid outskirts because it's not like the Shaded Woods where it's vision obstructed, but you can track enemies by listening, by watching. You get faked out by the player's phantoms roaming through. It's very cool, very atmospheric. This area just genuinely feels like it adds nothing to the DLC, and the boss fight is not worth the time to get there. It's not like the Dark Lurker where the fight is locked behind, quite frankly, an obnoxious questline that deprived 98% of this game's player base from ever even finding it, let alone beating it. This boss fight is just plain not fun. When I think about like the opinion of what people say Dark Souls 2 is, Frozen Outskirts is kind of that. It's a blank area with nonsense that ends in a bad, rehashed boss fight. I didn't hate Ivory King, I just think it's so much weaker than Burnt and Sunken that it's kind of wild that all three get lumped together. On repeat playthroughs, I think I'll probably just grab the crown and not bother too much more with the fight. The DLCs also unlock the true ending of the game. By presenting all three to Daddy Darkness Vendrick, you get a reinforced crown that stops you from hollowing, and that seems neat, but the world is ended, so maybe not. After fighting Nashandra, you then get a second fight with Aldia, and to be honest with you, these boss fights are incredibly weak. Almost seems to be intentional. I can't imagine that these two being such pushovers wasn't on purpose to give the player the idea that you really have pushed so far past the need for Nashandra or Aldia, and even the power they give you. This makes sense with the added ending of walking away. You aren't here for the throne. Remember, you did what you came to do, and it's time to search for the cure for the others, not just yourself. The bearer of the curse makes a decision for themselves for the first time in the game, without the need for Aldia or Nashandra guiding your intentions. I am so glad I was so wrong about Dark Souls 2, and I took the deep dive to figure it out. I know that there's a lot of armchair game devs out there who say that games should be self-explanatory, they shouldn't require outside thought or research, they should make the player want to know more intrinsically. But I think games can do that, and I think there's games that want you to take the time to fully immerse yourself in them. FromSoft games have always played coy with their systems and asked the player to engage with them on their own terms, and Dark Souls 2 does the same thing that all the other games do. I think it's fair to not like the game. After all, it is very different from the first, but to posture as though this game doesn't understand Dark Souls and it was a B-team cash grab is so fucking immature and disrespectful to the work that the devs put into crafting this world. How dare you suggest that FromSoft can only make a good game if Miyazaki is directly involved, and invalidate the years of talent and experience that the rest of the team spends poring over each of these games. I now refuse to subscribe to the belief that this game doesn't understand Dark Souls, because honestly, it may understand it better than the first game in some ways. When you peel back the criticisms that Dark Souls 2 just isn't Dark Souls 1, you realize a lot of that derision was from people trying to play Dark Souls 1 in Dark Souls 2 and getting mad that that just doesn't work. The same thing could be said about all of the other games, but it just, for whatever reason, stuck with 2. Maybe because it's the first numbered sequel, maybe because it was the third game in the series total, maybe because it tried to actually make a departure. I don't know. I really hope viewing this has at least helped someone decide to give the game another chance with the understanding of what it actually is and what it's trying to do. Full immersion as a series isn't really here to change someone's mind in a game, it's just my journey and experience taking the game in for value in all its systems. But if you do retry the game and end up liking it, I hope you'll come to understand why it took me 3 scripts and 3 installs of the game to get it to stick, and I ended up falling in love with it. The game will drown you, and it's worth letting it.
There is no path. We wander through the world blind, confused. Rarely do people know what they need. Never does that deter anyone from our furious, unstoppable ascent to the throne of want.